They say silence is the loudest sound in an empty house. I never understood that before. I used to think my home was defined by noise, the chaotic, beautiful symphony of a life well lived. I loved the sound of my kids, Leo and Mia, racing their toy cars down the hardwood hallway until they crashed into the baseboards. I loved the sizzle of garlic hitting a hot pan at 6 in the evening. Most of all, I loved the soft, melodic hum of my wife Sarah's voice as she moved from room to room, a woman who seemed entirely at peace with the world we had built. My name is Mark. For 10 years, I lived with the unshakable, perhaps arrogant belief that I was the luckiest man on the planet. Sarah wasn't just my wife, she was my anchor, my North Star. We met in college back when we had nothing but a beat-up acoustic guitar, a mountain of student debt, and a shared dream of a quiet, stable life. We built our world brick by brick. Literally. I spent a decade working 60-hour weeks on construction sites. I started as a site foreman, breathing in dust and sweat, eventually climbing the ladder to senior project manager. My hands were permanently calloused, and my back felt like a rusted hinge every single evening. But when I turned the key in the lock of our house, the one with the deep wraparound porch and the custom shutters, the exhaustion vanished. Sarah would meet me at the door with a smile that made the 12 hours of manual labor worth it. I felt like I could move mountains for her. I felt like a king in a kingdom of my own making. I trusted her more than I trusted my own heartbeat. Every bill, every bank account, every legal document, she handled the logistics. She was this smart one, the one who could stretch a dollar, plan the retirement accounts, and ensure our perimeter was secure. I just brought home the heavy paycheck and felt the pride of a provider. At least, that's what I told myself for 10 years. I didn't realize I was living in a golden cage, and the person holding the key had been picking my pockets the whole time. The shadow in the kitchen. It started on a Tuesday. A boring, unremarkable gray Tuesday. I had a meeting get pushed back at a massive hotel job site across town, and the weather was turning foul. I decided to head home 4 hours early to surprise her. I stopped at the local florist and bought a massive bouquet of white lilies, her absolute favorite, and planned to suggest we order some high-end sushi and watch a movie after the kids went to bed. When I walked into the house, the air felt different. It was unnervingly quiet. The kids were at their grandmother's for a scheduled sleepover, and Sarah was supposed to be at the small clothing boutique I had financed for her a year prior. It was her dream project, and even though it hadn't turned a profit yet, I was happy to cover the overhead just to see her glow with the title of business owner. But the kitchen light was on, casting a long, sharp shadow into the hallway. Sarah was sitting at the oak table, surrounded by a mountain of paperwork. She was so deep in thought that she didn't hear the heavy thud of my work boots on the rug. Her shoulders were shaking. She was crying, not a loud, dramatic sob, but a trapped, panicked weeping that sounded like someone drowning in shallow water. "Sarah?" I said softly, stepping into the light. She jumped nearly a foot in the air, her chair screeching against the floor. She almost knocked over a lukewarm cup of coffee. Her face turned ghost white in a split second, the color draining from her cheeks until she looked like a marble statue of grief. She immediately tried to scramble the papers into a frantic pile, sweeping them toward the kitchen drawer with trembling hands. But I'm a project manager. I'm trained to spot discrepancies from across a room. I saw the bank letterhead. It was a local credit union, one we didn't use. "Mark, you're home early. Why are you home?" Her voice was an octave too high, strained and brittle, like dry glass about to shatter. "Meeting got cancelled," I said, putting the lilies down on the counter. The smell of the flowers suddenly felt sickly sweet, almost funerary. "What's going on, Sarah? Why are you crying? And what are those papers?" She tried to block the drawer with her body, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. "Nothing, Mark. Just tax stuff for the boutique. You know how stressful the end of the quarter is with the city permits. Just boring. Go change, I'll start some dinner." "I didn't know you'd be here." The cold pit in my stomach, which had been a small spark of doubt, suddenly expanded into a freezing void. Intuition is a strange thing. It doesn't scream at you, it whispers, and right then, its whisper was like an ice pick to the brain. I walked toward the table, my boots sounding like thunder in the quiet kitchen. "Move, Sarah. Let me see the papers." "Mark, please, don't be like this. You wouldn't understand the filing system, it's just formalities." I reached past her. I didn't have to be rough. She was so weak with shock that she simply slumped to the side. I pulled the documents out of the drawer. The world started to blur as I read the legal jargon. It wasn't taxes. It wasn't a business permit. It was a second mortgage. A home equity line of credit. On our home. The home we had spent 10 years paying off, sacrificing vacations, new cars, and luxury to own outright. The home that was supposed to be the inheritance for Leo and Mia. The amount was staggering, $150,000. But the most gut-wrenching part wasn't the number. At the bottom of the page, right next to her elegant, loopy signature, was mine. A perfect, sweeping imitation of my handwriting. A forgery so precise it made my skin crawl. I had never seen this document in my life. I had never stepped foot in that credit union. My wife had spent hours, maybe days, practicing my name just to pawn our life for a pile of cash. The anatomy of a lie. I stared at my own forged name and felt the reality of my life dissolve into ash. The woman I kissed every morning, the woman who tucked our children into bed and whispered about our future, had spent her afternoons practicing how to steal from me. What is this, Sarah? My voice didn't sound like mine. It was deep, hollow, and dead. Where is the money? Where did $150,000 go? Sarah buried her face in her hands, her hair falling over her face like a veil. Mark, please. I was going to pay it back. You wouldn't have even noticed it was gone. I had a plan. Julian was in danger. Real, life-threatening danger. Julian, her younger brother. A professional entrepreneur who spent his entire life jumping from one shady multi-level marketing scheme to another. He was a human vacuum for money, and over the last 3 years, he had already drained us of nearly $10,000 in loans that I eventually just stopped asking about. I called it the family tax to keep the peace. Danger? What kind of danger is worth $150,000 in our house? I roared, the shock finally giving way to a white-hot, blinding rage. I slammed the papers down on the table. You forged my signature, Sarah? That's a felony. You gambled the roof over our kids' heads for a man who hasn't held a job for more than 3 months in his entire life. Don't call him that, she snapped, a flash of her old defiance crossing her face through the tears. He's my brother. He's my only brother. He got involved with some investors. Rough people. They told him if he didn't settle the debt from his last venture by the end of the month, they'd find him in a ditch. What was I supposed to do, Mark? Stand by and watch him get murdered over money? You were supposed to come to me. I screamed, the veins in my neck bulging. We are a team. We are a unit. Or am I just the labor? Am I just a human ATM that you trick when it's convenient for your real family? You wouldn't have said yes, she screamed back, standing up now, her face flushed with a mix of guilt and anger. You've always looked down on him. You would have told him to figure it out himself. I knew you wouldn't help, so I did what a sister has to do. I saved his life. No, I said, my voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm whisper that seemed to scare her more than the shouting. You did what a thief does. You stole from your husband. You stole from your children. You didn't save a life, Sarah. You ended ours. The vultures arrived. The nightmare was only beginning. That night, I didn't sleep in our bed. I sat in the living room, staring out the window at the dark street, watching the rain hit the glass. Sarah stayed in the kitchen for hours, crying and talking on the phone in hushed, frantic tones. The next morning, the family council began their assault. My phone began to blow up before I even had my first cup of coffee. Her mother, Margaret, called first. Margaret was a woman who lived for appearances, expensive church hats and a polished SUV, all while her own husband worked 2 jobs to keep her in the lifestyle. She didn't ask how I was. She didn't offer a word of apology for her daughter's criminal behavior. Mark, darling, let's not be dramatic. Her voice was smooth, dripping with that fake, manipulative honey. Julian is Sarah's flesh and blood. She acted out of a place of pure love. You have a wonderful career. You're a successful, strong man. You'll make that money back in a year or 2. Are you really going to destroy a 10-year marriage and a beautiful family over some bank paperwork? Some paperwork, Margaret? I felt a pulse thumping in my temple so hard it made my vision vibrate. Your daughter committed bank fraud. She stole the equity that I built with my own hands. She risked the stability of her own children. If Julian is so precious to you, why didn't you mortgage your house? Why didn't you sell that Lexus you're so proud of? How dare you speak to me like that? She hissed, the mask of the polite grandmother slipping instantly. We are family. Family helps each other in times of crisis. You should be proud to have a wife who is so loyal to her kin. Family doesn't rob each other in the dark to pay for a gambler's mistakes, I said, and I hung up before she could respond. I spent that day at the construction site, but I was a ghost. I stood on the 3rd floor of a half-finished hotel, looking down at the concrete, and for the first time in my life, I felt completely untethered. I kept picturing Sarah sitting at that kitchen table night after night, practicing my signature. I thought of every time we had sex, every time we laughed over dinner, every time we planned for the kids' college funds, all while she was secretly moving the chess pieces to bankrupt us for her loser brother. When I returned home that evening, the house was filled with the smell of pot roast, my favorite. The table was set. Candles were lit. It was a scene of domestic bliss that felt like a mockery. Sarah was dressed in a nice sweater, acting as if the previous night was just a rough patch that we would eventually move past. "Mark, honey, let's just eat and talk like adults," she said, reaching out to take my heavy work jacket. I flinched away from her touch as if she were a leper. "Don't touch me, Sarah. Ever again." "Oh, for heaven's sake. How long are you going to keep this up?" Her voice turned sharp and thin. I said, "I'm sorry. I'm doing everything I can. Julian says the money will be back in 30 days. I looked at her. She actually believed it. She was so deep in her own delusion that she thought $150,000 would just materialize from a man who couldn't pay his own phone bill. "I'm moving into the guest room," I said, my voice cold and flat. "And as of tomorrow morning, I'm closing our joint accounts. I'm taking my name off the boutique's lease. You're on your own, Sarah. And if that money isn't back in 30 days, you're going to find out exactly what happens when you push a patient man to his absolute limit." I walked into the guest room and turned the lock. That was the first night of the rest of my life. The man who provided was gone. The man who loved was dead. In their place stood someone I didn't recognize, someone who was done being the victim and was ready to become the predator. The 30-day deadline was a ghost hanging over our house, and every morning I watched Sarah wither a little more under its weight. She was still trying to play the part of the grieving, misunderstood wife, but I had moved past grief. I was in the cold, mechanical phase of survival. Here is part 2, the cracks in the foundation. Part 2, the Cold War and the second betrayal. The atmosphere in the house shifted from a tragedy to a Cold War. I stopped eating the meals she cooked. I stopped looking at her when she spoke. To the kids, I was still Dad. I took them to soccer, I helped with homework, and I kept the mask on. But the second they were in bed, the mask dropped, and I became a stranger living in the guest room. I didn't just sit there. I spent every night on my laptop, digging through our digital life like a forensic investigator. I didn't tell her I had hired a private investigator named Miller. I didn't tell her I had already spent $4,000, money from my new private account, to find out exactly where that $150,000 went. Sarah, meanwhile, was falling apart. She spent all day at her boutique, but the sales reports I intercepted showed she was barely making enough to pay the electric bill. She was constantly on the phone, her voice hushed and frantic, pacing the backyard. "He promised, Mark," she said one night, cornering me in the hallway. Her eyes were sunken, surrounded by dark circles. "Julian called. He said the investment is just tied up in escrow. He just needs 2 more weeks. Please, just give him 2 more weeks before you do anything crazy with the bank." "Escrow?" I laughed, a dry, hollow sound. "Sarah, your brother doesn't know how to spell escrow. The 30 days are up tomorrow. I'm going to the credit union in the morning to report the fraud." Her face went from pale to ashen. "You can't. If you report it as fraud, they'll investigate. They'll see my signature. Mark, I'll go to jail. Do you want the mother of your children in prison?" "You should have thought about that before you forged my name," I said, stepping around her. "You didn't just risk your freedom, Sarah. You risked ours. If the bank forecloses because you can't pay the month Julian promised, where do the children sleep?" "In Julian's imaginary escrow account." The investigators call. The next morning I didn't go to the bank. Not yet. I got a call from Miller, the PI. "Mark? I found him," Miller said. His voice was gravelly and professional. "Your brother-in-law isn't in danger. He isn't hiding from bad investors. He's currently in a high-rise condo in Miami. It was purchased 3 weeks ago. Cash." My heart didn't break this time. It turned into a block of ice. "Who's the owner of the condo, Miller?" "That's the thing," Miller sighed. "It's registered to a holding company. But the secondary contact on the HOA paperwork? It's not Julian. It's Sarah." I had to grip the steering wheel of my truck so hard I thought the leather would tear. She hadn't just given him the money to save his life. She had funneled our home equity into a secret property. This wasn't a desperate act of sisterly love, it was a coordinated exit strategy. She was building a nest egg with her brother using my sweat and my children's future as the lumber. I didn't go home. I went to the best divorce attorney in the state, a woman named Elena who had a reputation for being a shark in a silk suit. I laid the documents on her desk, the forged mortgage, the PI's report on the Miami condo, and the bank statements showing Sarah had been skimming from her boutique's accounts for months. Elena looked at the pile and then looked at me. You realize that if we go full throttle on the fraud charges, she could face significant prison time? Especially with the forged federal documents. She made her choice when she signed my name, I said. I want the house. I want full custody. And I want her to be legally responsible for every cent of that debt. Can you do it? With this evidence? Elena smiled thinly. I can do more than that. I can make sure she leaves with exactly what she brought into this marriage. Nothing. The confrontation. I stayed out late that night. I wanted the kids to be asleep. I wanted the stage to be clear for the final act of the evening. When I walked in at 10 p.m., Sarah was waiting in the living room. She had a bottle of wine open and she looked smug. For the first time in weeks, she wasn't crying. I have good news, she said, leaning back on the sofa. Julian sent a wire. It's only $10,000, but it's a start. He said the rest will be here by the end of the month. You see? I told you he was a good person. I told you I knew what I was doing. I walked over to the coffee table and tossed a folder onto it. It was the photos Miller had taken. Photos of Julian lounging by a pool in Miami. Photos of the condo documents with her name on the HOA contact list. The smugness evaporated. She reached for the folder, her hand shaking so violently she knocked over her wine. Red liquid pooled across the white rug, looking like a bloodstain. What is this? That's your danger, Sarah, I said, my voice vibrating with a decade of suppressed fury. That's the life-threatening debt you had to pay. You didn't save him. You joined him. You stole $150,000 from our family to buy a vacation home while I was working 12-hour shifts in the mud. Mark, no. It's not what it looks like. She scrambled off the sofa, falling to her knees. Julian said, he said we needed a backup. He said with the economy being so unstable, we needed an asset you couldn't touch. Was for us. For our retirement. An asset I couldn't touch? I stepped closer, looking down at her. You mean an asset you could run to when you decided you were tired of being a mother and a wife? You forged my name to rob me of my own home so you could have a backup plan with your loser brother? I was scared, she shrieked. You're always so controlling with the money. I just wanted something of my own. Controlling? I felt a hysterical laugh bubble up. I gave you a boutique. I paid every bill. I put your name on everything I ever built. And this is how you get something of your own? By stealing it from me? The family closes in. Just then the front door swung open. It was her mother, Margaret, and her father, Bob. They must have been waiting around the corner for her signal. Now look here, Mark, Bob started, trying to use his big man voice. Sarah told us you were getting aggressive. We won't have you bullying our daughter in her own home. Her own home. I turned on him. Bob, you're an accountant. Tell me, what do you call it when someone forges a signature on a $150,000 loan? Is that bullying, or is that grand larceny? Bob blinked, his bravado wavering. She did it for the family, Mark. Julian was. Julian is in Miami in a condo paid for by my kids' college fund. I shouted. And Sarah's name is on the paperwork. Are you in on this too, Bob? Did you help her with the forgery? Because if you did, you can tell the police all about it. The room went silent. Margaret tried to speak, but for once, her manipulative honey had dried up. She looked at her daughter, who was still on the floor, weeping into the wine-stained rug. I've already spoken to an attorney, I said, my voice returning to that deadly, quiet calm. I've already filed for divorce. And tomorrow morning, I'm filing a police report for the forgery. Mark, please? Sarah grabbed my leg. Don't do this. Think of Leo and Mia. They need their mother. They need a mother who doesn't steal their roof, I said, prying her hands off me. You have 1 hour to pack a bag. Your parents are here, they can take you. If you're still in this house in 61 minutes, I'm calling the cops right now. You can't kick her out. Margaret yelled. This is her house. Actually, I said, pulling a paper from my pocket. Since the loan was fraudulent and I am the primary on the original deed, my lawyer has already filed an emergency injunction. But honestly, I don't need the law to tell you to leave. I'm telling you. Get out of my sight before I lose the last shred of mercy I have. I watched them. I watched the perfect family scurry around, grabbing clothes and toiletries, whispering in the hallway. I stood in the kitchen and watched the clock. At the 59-minute mark, the front door closed. I was alone. The house was quiet. But for the first time in a month, it wasn't the silence of fear. It was the silence of a clean slate. But I wasn't done. Sarah thought she was going to Miami to live in her backup plan. She didn't realize that I had one more move to make, one that would ensure that Julian and Sarah's little paradise turned into a prison of their own making. The silence that followed the slamming of the front door was the heaviest thing I'd ever felt. I stood in the middle of our kitchen, staring at the red wine stain on the white rug, a permanent, jagged scar on a house that used to be a sanctuary. It looked like a map of a country I no longer recognized. But I didn't have time to mourn. Mourning is for people who have lost something they can't replace. I hadn't lost a wife, I had excised a tumor. And when you're performing surgery on your own life, you don't stop until the margins are clean. Sarah thought she was escaping to her parents' house to regroup and plot. She thought that Miami condo was her golden parachute, her happily ever after with her golden boy brother. She didn't realize that when you play a game of shadows with a man who builds foundations for a living, you're the one standing on hollow ground. The midnight execution. The next 48 hours were a blur of cold, calculated execution. I didn't sleep. I didn't need to. The adrenaline of betrayal is more potent than any drug. I spent the night in the guest room, the blue light of my laptop screen reflecting in my eyes like a digital predator. First I called the bank. Not to report the fraud, not yet. I called to discuss the arrears on the second mortgage. I knew Sarah hadn't made a single payment. I spoke to a collections manager, a woman who sounded like she'd heard every lie in the book. I told her I was aware of the irregularity, and that my attorney would be sending over a formal notice of stay. I wasn't asking for mercy, I was buying time to move my pieces. Then I called Miller, my private investigator. It was 1 a.m. Miller, I said, my voice sounding like gravel being crushed. The HOA paperwork for that condo in Miami. You said Sarah's name is on it. Is she the primary owner or just the contact? She's a 50-50 owner with Julian under that shell company, Mark, Miller replied. I could hear him typing in the background. Registered in Delaware. It's a classic setup. Why? Because if she's the owner, that condo is a marital asset, I said, a slow, dark grin forming on my face. And if it was purchased with stolen funds from our home equity, it's not just an asset, it's the smoking gun. If I can get Julian to flip, I can seize the whole thing before she even packs her sunglasses. What are you planning? I'm going to give Julian a choice, I said. And knowing Julian, he's going to choose himself every single time. He doesn't have a loyal bone in his body, not even for the sister who robbed her kids for him. The call to the snake. I waited until 2:30 a.m. I knew Julian's rhythm. I knew he'd be out at some overpriced club in South Beach, burning through the equity of my children's future. When he finally picked up, his voice was thick with bass music, expensive gin, and an ego that hadn't been checked in years. Mark. My man, he shouted over the music. Sarah told me you were having a little midlife crisis. Relax, bro. The money is coming. It's all part of the process. Don't be such a buzzkill. The process is over, Julian, I said, my voice so flat and icy it seemed to cut through the music on his end. I heard him step into a quieter hallway. Listen to me very carefully. I have the deed to the Miami condo. I have the bank trail showing every cent of that $150,000 moving from my forged mortgage into your Delaware shell company. I also have a recorded statement from Sarah, my wife, saying you coerced her into the forgery. She's throwing you under the bus, Julian. The silence on the other end was deafening. The cool guy facade didn't just crack, it shattered. She said what? Mark, she's lying. It was her idea. She's the one who wanted a backup plan. She said you were a boring drone and she wanted a life with some actual excitement. She's the one who practiced the signature for 3 days. I don't care whose idea it was, I lied, enjoying the sound of his panic. Here's how this goes. My PI is standing outside your condo door right now with a tablet. You sign over your half of that shell company to me. Right now. You do that, and I might forget to mention your name to the district attorney when I file the grand larceny report against Sarah tomorrow morning. You sign and you walk away. You don't sign, and the Miami PD picks you up for money laundering before the sun comes up. You'd send your own wife to prison? Julian whispered, his voice trembling. She stopped being my wife when she signed my name to a death warrant for our home. You have 5 minutes, Julian. After that, I call the cops. He signed it in 4 minutes and 12 seconds. Julian didn't hesitate. He didn't defend his sister. He didn't try to protect the woman who had ruined her life to give him a lifestyle he didn't earn. He traded Sarah's freedom for his own without a second thought. I watched the notification pop up on my screen. Document signed. #### the final confrontation. 3 days later, Sarah showed up at the house. She wasn't the broken, weeping woman I had seen on the floor. She had been empowered by her mother. She was wearing a new designer dress, likely bought with the last few thousand she had skimmed, and she had Margaret trailing behind her like a lady in waiting. She walked into the kitchen like she still owned the air we breathed. She tossed her keys on the granite counter with a sharp clack. "I'm here for the rest of my things, Mark," she said, her voice full of a brittle, false confidence. "And don't bother with the threats. My mom's lawyer says since we're still legally married, I have a right to stay here. In fact, we're going to put this house on the market and split the equity. I'm moving to Miami on Friday. Julian is already setting up the guest room for me." I didn't even look up from my coffee. I just pushed a thick manila envelope across the table. "Julian isn't waiting for you, Sarah. Julian is currently being evicted by the new owner of that condo. Me." She froze, her hand halfway to her bag. "What? That's impossible. The company that Julian just signed over to me in exchange for his own immunity," I said, finally meeting her eyes. The look of pure, unadulterated shock on her face was better than any paycheck I'd ever earned. "He told me everything, Sarah. He told me it was your idea. He told me you called me a bore. He even forwarded me the texts where you joked about how easy it was to manipulate me because I was too busy playing construction worker to notice." The blood drained from her face until she looked like a ghost. Even Margaret looked stunned, her mouth hanging open. "He wouldn't?" Sarah whispered, her voice breaking. "He's my brother. I gave him everything. I destroyed my life for him. You didn't save him, Sarah. You fed a shark and now he's finished with you. I've already sold the condo to a developer. The proceeds went directly to the bank this morning to settle the second mortgage. The debt is gone. And so is your backup plan. You have no money, no brother, and no house. You monster." Margaret shrieked, stepping forward. That was her future. "How could you be so cruel?" "Cruel?" I stood up, looming over them both. The sheer physical presence of my anger made them both flinch. "Cruel is stealing from your children. Cruel is forging your husband's name while he's out working in the rain to keep you in silk. Sarah, the police are at the end of the driveway. I didn't just file for the mortgage fraud. I found the older records. I found where you've been signing my name on credit card applications for years. It's called identity theft and it's a federal offense." The room went cold as the blue and red lights began to pulse against the kitchen walls, reflecting off the very windows I had installed with my own hands. Sarah started to scream, a high, thin sound of a trapped animal. She tried to run for the back door, but 2 officers were already coming through the mudroom. As the steel handcuffs clicked shut around her wrists, the reality finally truly hit her. She looked around the kitchen, at the heights of Leo and Mia marked in pencil on the pantry door, at the flowers I'd bought her that were now rotting in the trash, and she realized she had traded it all for a brother who sold her out for a signature. "Mark," she wailed as they led her out. "I love you. I did it for us. Please don't let them take me." I didn't say a word. I just watched her go. I watched the car pull away until the sirens faded into the distance. The new architecture. It's been a year now. The divorce was a slaughter. With the criminal convictions for forgery and identity theft, Sarah didn't get a single penny. She's currently serving time in a state facility. Her boutique is a nail salon now. Her parents don't call me anymore, and the silence is the most beautiful sound I've ever heard. The house is quiet, but it's a good quiet. Leo and Mia are with me full-time. We've scrubbed that wine stain out of the rug. We've repainted the walls. Every Sunday we build something together, birdhouses, bookshelves, memories. The air in this house finally feels clean. Sometimes I sit on the porch after they're asleep and look at the stars. I realize I wasn't lucky for 10 years. I was just a man who built a beautiful house on a foundation of sand. But the fire that burned it all down also forged me into something unbreakable. I lost $150,000. I lost a wife. I lost a decade of trust. But I kept my children. I kept my integrity. And I kept the one thing she could never forge, the truth.